Right, so Father Gabriel Romanelli had become almost inadvertently a symbol of human resilience amid the devastation of Gaza. For months he answered the phone every night to hear Pope Francis's reassuring words, his parish functioning as one of the last sanctuaries in a city reduced to rubble. Romanelli is of course the pastor of the Holy Family Catholic Church, Gaza's only Catholic place of worship. He had been sheltering hundreds of displaced civilians, many elderly, disabled or children, doing the Christian thing, of course. It's the Christian thing to do. And yet yesterday, Israeli tank shells tore through that sanctuary, killing at least 3 civilians, including 2 women, and wounding at least 10 others, amongst them Romanelli himself, whose leg was hastily bandaged before he was rushed to Al-Ahli Hospital. Images of shattered pews and broken stained glass and Father Romanelli lying in shock among the rubble rapidly spread across the world, provoking anger far beyond the usual pro-Palestinian circles. The incident was more than just another tragedy in Gaza's long list of tragedies, though. It was a symbolic moment that reinforces a growing perception that Israel's campaign in Gaza was no longer just a war against Hamas or even against the civilian populace of Gaza either, but that it has become a war against faith itself. And when we look at the broader context of that statement beyond Gaza to the West Bank too, and beyond Christianity as well, it's becoming very hard to see things otherwise, yet more hypocrisy from the self-declared Jewish state that weaponizes anti-Semitism to silence its critics, yet seemingly cannot extend that same demand for religious respect to other faiths. When a priest personally known to the former Pope is maimed in a bombardment, Israel's carefully crafted narrative of precision targeting becomes an even bigger joke, doesn't it? This was not an isolated accident, but part of a broader pattern of disregard for non-Jewish life and heritage, a pattern evident in the destruction of over 1,000 mosques, repeated strikes on churches, and the abuse of Islamic holy sites in the West Bank. Israel would never tolerate synagogues getting targeted in retaliatory strikes on it. So why should they hide behind claims of religious persecution, Zionist falsehoods as they are, when they appear to be very much engaged in that themselves? Right, so first off, caveat time. A point I want to make from the get-go before we get into this. Israeli targeting of Muslim and Christian sites, as I'm going to go into, is on Zionism, not Judaism. Regardless of Israel's claims to be a Jewish state, far too many Jews around the world will readily refute that, quite gladly too. It is a Zionist state, and what they are doing and saying and claiming endangers Jewish people, and I just want to make it clear from the get-go that my ire is firmly aimed at Zionism, as it always is. The fact I felt the need to make the distinction between a global religion and a white supremacist colonial Western project in the Middle East just goes to show how successful years of Israeli propaganda has been on such matters, but we're all pulling that apart now, aren't we? So let's get on with this. To understand why religious sites have become expendable in Israel's military calculus, it helps to first examine the ideological framework underpinning Israeli policy. From its inception, the Zionist project viewed the indigenous population, Muslim and Christian alike, as Palestinians are, as an obstacle to the realization of a Jewish homeland. This attitude was evident during the Nakba of 1948, when over 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated, their mosques desecrated or repurposed, and churches abandoned or seized. The historian Ilan Pape has documented how mosques in depopulated towns were frequently converted into synagogues or warehouses, while Christian sanctuaries were left to decay in his important book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. This underlying view that Palestinian life and heritage are dispensable remains embedded in Israeli military doctrine today. The Dahiyya Doctrine, first raised during the 2006 Lebanon War, explicitly calls for the use of overwhelming, disproportionate force against civilian infrastructure to deter resistance. In Gaza, this translates into treating entire neighborhoods, schools, and indeed places of worship as potential military targets. Israeli officials routinely claim that Hamas uses mosques to store weapons, effectively stripping them of their civilian or sacred status. Even when evidence is lacking, the presumption of guilt persists. Churches, although not accused of harbouring weapons, are still hit, revealing that the issue is not merely one of military necessity, but one of institutional indifference as well. The difference between striking mosques and churches is that one causes great offence to Western nations, which are far more predominantly Christian, so it's all about the optics when they raise one as Hamas command centres, but apologise for the other. The rise of far-right figures such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich has only deepened this attitude. Ben-Gvir is a disciple of the extremist Rabbi Meir Kahan, openly framing the conflict as a holy war, and calls for Jewish sovereignty over all historic Palestine. Smotrich has repeatedly stated that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, denying the legitimacy of their cultural and religious heritage. These ideological currents permeate government policy, making the destruction of non-Jewish holy sites not simply collateral damage, but the logical outcome of a worldview that denies the sacredness of Palestinian life and history. The destruction of Gaza's mosques has been staggering in both scale and symbolism. According to Gaza's Ministry of Religious Affairs, and corroborated by UN and independent observers, over 1,100 mosques have been completely destroyed and nearly 900 more damaged since October of 2023. That's not a handful of mistakes in a chaotic war, therefore. That's a pattern that amounts to cultural genocide. Among the most significant losses was the Great Amari Mosque, a 7th century structure and one of Gaza's oldest Islamic landmarks. Reduced to rubble at the end of 2023, its destruction erased a living link to Gaza's Islamic and Byzantine heritage. The Ibn Uthman Mosque and the Al-Kabir Mosque, both centuries old, suffered similar fates. These were not just places of prayer, they were community centres, they were repositories of history and symbols of continuity for a people under siege. Israel insists that many of these mosques were legitimate military targets, of course, because Hamas allegedly used them to store weapons. However, investigations by the likes of Al Jazeera or B'Tselem and other independent bodies have found no evidence to substantiate these claims in numerous cases, as is so often the case amid Israeli claims of anything. Even if weapons were stored in some of these locations, though, the principle of proportionality under international humanitarian law requires that the cultural and civilian significance of a site be weighed before attacking. Article 53 of the Hague Regulations explicitly prohibits attacks on religious and cultural sites unless they are being used for military purposes in a way that directly contributes to combat. So the sheer scale of destruction strongly suggests that is very much not the case. For the Muslim world, these strikes are not perceived merely as military actions, they are acts of desecration. Iran, Turkey, Qatar, they've all seized on this narrative, portraying Israel as conducting a war on Islam itself, as much as the people of Gaza. Even more cautious states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been forced to issue unusually strong condemnations, reflecting the anger of their own populations. In countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, public outrage is translated into expanded boycotts of Israeli-linked goods and companies. The destruction of mosques is not just a military strategy, it's also a public relations catastrophe in the Muslim world, very much in a manner that hurts Israel, actually, via the backlash of that. Malaysia, having been part of those Hague Group talks in Colombia earlier this week, now set to implement widespread sanctions on Israel, as finally some nations are at last set to do so, as I covered in a video just yesterday. The destruction of mosques has inflamed Muslim-majority nations. The attacks on churches have dealt a severe blow to Israel's moral credibility in Christian-majority countries, notably predominantly in the West. Unlike the mosque strikes, Israel cannot plausibly argue that churches shelter militants or store weapons. The Christian population of Gaza is, after all, tiny, numbering only a few hundred, and their churches have long served as humanitarian shelters. The Holy Family Catholic Church strike this week has been particularly damaging for Israel. This was not just any church, it was a symbol of resilience for Gaza's Christian minority. It was housing 400 to 600 displaced civilians, many of them children, elderly and disabled. It was well known to international observers as a safe haven. Father Gabriel Romanelli, the parish priest, had been in daily contact with Pope Francis before the pontiff's death, making him one of the most high-profile Christian figures in Gaza. His wounding, along with the deaths of Palestinians in his care, have shocked Catholic communities worldwide, as both Press TV and Cuds News have noted. This was not an isolated incident either. Barely a week into the genocide of Gaza, back in mid-October 2023, Israeli airstrikes hit the Greek Orthodox St. Porphyrius Church, killing 18 civilians who had sought refuge there. The cumulative effect of these attacks has been to frame Israel not merely as an occupying power, but as a state willing to kill Christian civilians in their sanctuaries. And the backlash has been significant. Pope Leo XIV issued an unusually strong condemnation, calling this week's strikes on his church a sacrilege. Caritas Internationalis, the World Council of Churches, and the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem demanded accountability too. In Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni described the strike as unacceptable. In Latin America, countries such as Brazil and Chile and Colombia have cited the attacks on churches as further justification for suspending trade and arms deals with Israel. Christian charities across Europe have joined the BDS movement, cutting financial ties with Israeli companies. So this growing Christian backlash matters because it undermines one of Israel's traditional strongholds of support. While US evangelicals remain staunchly pro-Israel, as shown by them now literally running those lethal aid sites in Gaza, Catholic and Orthodox communities in both North and South America are becoming more vocal in their opposition. For Israel, the moral cost of these church strikes may prove far more damaging in the long term than any battlefield losses, because as they cry victim on the basis of their Jewishness, endangering Jews globally in doing so at that, how they are treating other religions comes into sharp focus, and where ire from that should be aimed at Zionism, it will inevitably be aimed at some Jews by some. So, frankly, Jewish people, I would argue, are going to be as angry as Christians and Muslims here, if not more so. If Gaza's mosques and churches illustrate the consequences of war, the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron represents the long-term institutionalized nature of Israel's contempt for non-Jewish sacred spaces. One of Islam's holiest sites, revered also by Jews as the Cave of the Patriarchs, the mosque has been systematically transformed into a segregated militarized space. The turning point came on the 25th of February 1994, when American-Israeli settler Baruch Goldstein massacred 29 Muslim worshippers during dawn prayers. Instead of restoring Muslim control, Israel punished the victims by dividing the site into separate Jewish and Muslim areas and imposing draconian restrictions on Palestinian worshippers. Over the years, Israel has expanded Jewish-controlled areas, installed settler-only pathways and elevators, and silenced the adhan, the call to prayer, hundreds of times a year. As Middle East Eye have covered, the current government has now gone even further with plans to fully hand the site over to Jewish settlers. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have openly advocated turning the site fully into a synagogue, effectively erasing its Islamic identity completely. For Muslims worldwide, this would be the ultimate insult, a symbolic erasure of Islamic history at one of its holiest sites. UNESCO, which designated the Ibrahimi Mosque a World Heritage Site in danger in 2017, has repeatedly warned of Israeli attempts to alter the character and integrity of the site. Yet these warnings have, of course, been repeatedly ignored. The Ibrahimi Mosque stands as a microcosm of Israeli policy, a combination of religious apartheid, cultural appropriation, and settler colonialism. It is also a warning of what may come elsewhere. If Israel succeeds in its plans for the mosque, it will embolden similar efforts at other shared or Muslim-controlled holy sites, including perhaps even Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque. The cumulative effect of these attacks is shaping global perceptions of the conflict. In Muslim-majority nations, the destruction of mosques has galvanized public anger. In Christian-majority countries, the church strikes have caused a moral reckoning too, but only amongst those populations who have heard about this, because we know what our media is like, don't we? Catholic and Orthodox communities have, however, been demanding that their governments reevaluate their ties with Israel. In Latin America, the attacks have already led to diplomatic and economic consequences. In Europe, Christian charities are joining those divestment campaigns, boosting the BDS movement's legitimacy. Even in the United States, traditionally unwavering support is beginning to fracture, particularly amongst Catholic voters. International legal bodies are also taking notice. The International Court of Justice is under pressure to investigate Israel for cultural genocide and religious persecution. UNESCO has begun formal inquiries into the destruction of heritage sites in Gaza. Israel's war on Gaza is no longer framed merely as a conflict against Hamas by destroying mosques and striking churches and seizing Muslim holy sites under Zionist pretenses of Judaism. Israel has increasingly framed itself as a state at war with faith itself. Whether intentional or not, the symbolism is unmistakable. Not even the priest the Pope called nightly is wounded under Israeli tank fire, when 1,100 mosques are flattened, when sacred spaces that have stood for over a millennium are reduced to rubble. Israel's narrative of precision warfare and their claims of victimhood because of their Jewishness all collapse under the weight of its own actions and hypocrisy. The consequences are already visible. Israel is becoming isolated not just diplomatically, but morally. Muslims and Christians, who are often divided by history, are finding common cause in condemning what they now see as an assault on their shared religious heritage. Every missile that hits a mosque or a church destroys not only stone walls, but also Israel's carefully cultivated legitimacy on the world stage, and makes a mockery of their too often used victim status. If this trajectory continues, if Israel fully converts the Ibrahimi Mosque into a synagogue or strikes more churches in Gaza, the backlash will just deepen. Though, of course, what they still have on their side are government leaders and mainstream Western media, so I wonder how much of this story you've even heard about. What was once seen as a political and territorial conflict will also be remembered as a war on the sacred. And in that war, Israel may find that it has finally united the world's faiths against it, and its cries of victimhood on the basis of being Jewish in their case will fall increasingly on deaf ears. For more on the sanctions facing Israel now as the Hague Group finalises their 6-point plan of action to now be implemented, please do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.